Hello and welcome to Trader Talk TV. I'm Lindsay Roundtree and today I am joined by Ben Holmes, who is Technical Account Manager at MiQ. Welcome, Ben.
Thanks for having me, Lindsay.
Great to have you. And today we're talking about DOOH, Digital Out of Home.
Yes, we are.
Before we get into that, I want to find out more about, for those that don't know, what MiQ is, what they're about, and then of course what it is that you do at MiQ as well.
Yeah, so MiQ are a programmatic media partner, and we work with agencies and clients directly to deliver custom media solutions in the programmatic space. For those of you who don't know, our business was founded in traditional programmatic channels, so that of web, native video, predominantly web-based environments. And I guess our success over the last 10 years is predominantly due to our approach to programmatic rather than investing in an individual piece of technology or data source. And that allows us to actually deliver outcomes for clients based on the fact that we can agile in market and utilise tech and data in the best cases. If we look at the last 2-3 years, our business has developed massively. Obviously, there's the privacy-centric approach to advertising now. There's the cookieless agenda, and obviously we're seeing legacy channels such as TV, audio, and digital at home start going through that digital transformation. And our approach to programmatic always stays the same. And because of that, we can start actually offering these opportunities better for clients, start facilitating the programmatic opportunities across these new channels.
Interesting. So it puts you in a very good space then for being the legacy business that you have is able to facilitate the upcoming changes in traditional media.
Yes.
So what is it you do at MiQ?
Yeah, so I've been with MiQ for just under 6 years now. I started life as a trader in our Manchester office and actually traded our first digital out-of-home campaigns in the UK and across EMEA. And I guess it's my expertise and my knowledge in that space which allowed me to pursue a move into the UK strategy team, where I develop local product on behalf of the UK business.
Interesting. So before we find out exactly the difference between what traditional out of home is and what programmatic digital out of home is, let's find out more about kind of what MiQ's journey on out of home has been and kind of how you've been working on it for the past couple of years.
Yeah, so we started running digital out of home activity in 2019, predominantly through View, which is like JCDecaux's inventory.
Yeah.
And at that time, we didn't actually have any bespoke DSPs or anything to buy, so we leveraged our contacts at Xandr to use one of their video workflows to actually run digital out of home. And for us, it was more about a bit of a testing bed to actually test the capabilities of the actual channel, actually understand if we can actually feasibly scale it. And across 2019, we run several campaigns quite successfully on behalf of several different clients. And moving into 2020, we were confident. We started having the building blocks to actually start running digital at home. And this thing called COVID happened.
Kaboom.
Kaboom. And for us internally, it kind of put everything on a bit of the back burner for us, but we still had the foundations for our product across that year. But during that meantime, the last 12 to 18 months, the actual industry as a whole has had to develop and actually accelerate much quicker. So if you look at the industry today, you've got far more inventory in the market than we used to have. So like the majority of media owners now are pushing inventory programmatic. If you look at data as well, we're seeing a lot more bespoke data sources in markets like AdSquare and Skyrise, which are probably more privacy focused than cookieless data sets in market, which lend the hand to digital at home activation. And as well, technology has massively improved as well. So at the time I mentioned, we didn't really have a DSP, we're buying through Xandr. Now there's the point solutions, things like HiveStack, which are great to obviously transact digital at home on. And there's obviously the omnichannel opportunity with the likes of Trade Desk as well, and we're looking to explore all of those. And I think if we look at where the market is today, I think both traditional buyers and digital buyers can start capitalising the digital out of home opportunity quite well. And like I said, MiQ's experience in both programmatic and digital at home allows us to do that quite nicely, really.
Brilliant. It's interesting as well that you say that obviously the pandemic had a massive impact on the out-of-home industry in terms of there were no people about, so how can you advertise outdoors? But it sounds like technology development didn't actually slow down during that time period. There was still progression there in spite of that.
I think if, obviously I'm not sell side of that, but I think if I was part of the digital out-of-home industry, I know my business has to start pivoting. I think if you look at a lot of people who might have bought traditional out-of-home on a guarantee basis at a point in time, COVID's now happened, you still had to commit to that revenue or that campaign. So programmatic as a channel or an opportunity allows more flexibility for buyers, and I think if anything the pandemic's allowed the digital transformation to accelerate in the digital out-of-home space. Very
interesting. So the important question is, obviously everyone is very much aware of what out-of-home is, and they've heard digital out-of-home, they've heard programmatic digital out-of-home. What is the difference between the digital version and the traditional version that we know and love?
So I think I hope I'm going to try and do a bit of comparison here in relation from a buyer's perspective. And the first thing I just want to talk about is obviously, let me just use your whiteboard for a second. So the first thing I just want to talk about is how you physically buy out of home. Ultimately, what is the point of sale? So if you're a traditional out of home buyer, as you probably know, everything's done on a direct basis. You need to have relationships with media owners in place to actually book a campaign. And from a buyer's perspective, obviously it's quite relationship based. You need to understand what inventory is in a certain area, and you get that from having that direct relationship with a media owner. Now, if I'm a buyer, and one of my objectives is to maximise coverage in a certain area, we may have to start facilitating campaigns across several different media owners. So, as you can imagine, it can be quite high touch and quite a time invasive process to allow you to do that. So that's the main thing. The first thing is obviously it's direct. Now, if you compare that to programmatic digital at home, obviously using technology to buy and obviously using a DSP rather than having that direct relationship, obviously it's really important to still have those relationships with media owners in place. Obviously, these are things like sort rates out, sort deals out, and push P&Ps into a DSP. But ultimately, it's much lower touch. And actually, the use of a DSP, brings massive advantages for buyers. So you've got much greater control. You've got much more flexibility when it comes to things like reporting and tracking your campaign. All of it's in one centralised location. So when it comes to actually buying, the efficiencies gained from programmatic are massively improved by using a DSP. So now we've got the ways actually how to buy. The next thing is like what you are physically buying. I'm going to break this down into three main parts. There's inventory type, there's a purchase type, and accessibility as well. Sorry for spelling that. So trying to put this in the context of an actual buyer. So when you want to book a campaign down with a media owner, you'll send over your campaign requirements, things like flight dates, things like budget, your targeting criteria, and a media owner will respond with a campaign laydown which best suits that targeting plan. Now, from a media buyer's perspective, there's a little bit of amending you can do. You can drop sites in and out what best actually fit that campaign. But ultimately, what you're looking to do is agree on a brief which you're going to buy at some point in the future. So there's guaranteed. There's obviously you're buying a tenancy at some point in the future, which is like a share of voice. And accessibility is going to be fixed at some point in the future. So now we want to compare that with a programmatic approach. So the first thing to understand, or actually enables programmatic buying, instead of a guaranteed buy, you're buying on a non-guaranteed basis.
Right.
And I just want to weigh up some of the pros and cons there. So first of all, looking at the out-of-home inventory, unlike typical programmatic, there's a finite supply of inventory. And therefore, from a media buyer's perspective, it's probably quite nice to guarantee inventory at some point in the future, because ultimately there's probably quite high competition for that. And obviously from a buyer's perspective, it minimises risk. I know my advertising is going to be sold at some point in the future. But to enable programmatic buying, everything's pushed on an unguaranteed basis. And whilst it can potentially seem quite risky for buyers, obviously I feel like now in the industry, with the increase in inventory in the market, it's been negating the risk a little bit. I think if we compare when we first started running digital out-of-home activity back in 2019, we encountered a few times when we went to go live on a certain campaign and there was actually not any inventory available to buy.
Right, yeah.
So obviously, when we were working with one media owner, that was one of the challenges. But as mentioned, several different media owners are now pushing inventory into the ecosystem, and it's making it a lot easier to kind of negate this risk now. But they're having a non-guaranteed basis, which allows the following point. So the second part obviously is purchase type. So obviously when you're buying out of home, you're physically buying out of home space. But ultimately, what this backs out to is also the number of impacts and number of impressions. So when you buy a traditional out of home campaign, you get your laydown with a set number of impacts. So for example, the number of audience you've got to reach, and that's calculated typically through route data.
Yeah.
When you're transacting in programmatic, you actually buy that audience instead. And the way this is calculated is through impression multipliers. So to give you an example of that is, say for example you want to buy a billboard in Euston Station, you maybe buy that 10-second spot, but what that actually might equate to is say 20-30 people who actually see that billboard, and that's what you actually buy, and you're buying an audience in real time.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
It does.
Yeah. And finally, the final point which I think allows programmatic to actually add value to this is the accessibility or addressability. So you're buying in real time, and you're also buying on a panel by panel basis. And I think for me, this is where programmatic really comes into its own. So typically as a buyer, if you're going to buy, I guess, one IO, you're buying one single buying point. Now, with programmatic, you can start buying on a panel by panel basis.
What does that mean? What does panel by panel mean in an out-of-home context?
Yeah, so effectively what you're able to do is to bid on or win individual slots within an actual billboard itself. Okay. So instead of having like a flat rotation throughout the day, maybe like a 1 in 6 rotation, you're able to now pick and choose which hours of the day, which days of the week you actually want to start buying on.
Right.
And this, for me, is where the biggest opportunity comes in, is it allows data to, similar to how programmatic at the moment allows you to use the data to actually inform if you want to buy a certain impression. That's what programmatic actually allows you to do in digital at home. You can start being at one-to-one addressability. The final point I just want to talk about is data, which obviously informs these plans. So if you think about a traditional out-of-home buyer, there might be some planning done on the buyer's side, which says, if I'm targeting, for example, a student audience, I might want to be closer to colleges or universities or people where places where students go out, for example. So that plan gets sent over to a traditional out-of-home, like a media owner. And there's some data which they may put on the plan itself, but ultimately it's quite assumptive and quite broad. So if I just put historic here. Now with programmatic, you can start utilising data sets we're probably more familiar with. So for example, we could look at like campaign level data, we can start looking at mobile location data, all of which can come in and actually influence that buy. So for example, if we know an audience is present in a certain area, we may choose to bid on that inventory or not. And ultimately, if we take a step back here, what the benefits of each of these approaches take. So traditional at home, you're maximising your effectiveness via mass reach effectively, where programmatic digital at home comes to its own by the ability to actually target audiences more effectively.
And how are we finding these audiences? These audiences are based on what exists in the DSP. So how am I choosing an audience versus what I would traditionally do in out of home?
So if we just think about some of the data which can go into this, we've partnered with people, like AdSquare, I can go into it later about our approach, but ultimately, effectively, it comes down to the location of that user. So we may see where a user is in real time. We can then look to try and bid on that, but ultimately, it comes down to geocontextual data sets, and is what we utilise.
Okay, interesting. So next, I'm fascinated in finding out exactly how you would, in the new out-of-home world where it's digital programmatic, how you would actually plan and then activate a campaign. Yeah,
so I think if we look at the way MiQ approaches digital out-of-home, it's quite similar to how we approach other channels in general. So obviously we have a planning phase, we have activation phase, so obviously which DSPs, our optimization strategies, and obviously a measurement phase as well, which ultimately tries to measure where you actually serve, but also measure the impact. So we take the planning phase, we can break this down into two main parts, and I'm going to attempt to try and draw the UK here, so please bear with me.
Ad tech art at its finest, guys.
Apologies.
Very exciting.
I actually think that's one of the better ones I've actually done.
And can I say it looks like a kangaroo with a cherry in its pouch?
Yeah, I'm going to draw another line for you as well. But ultimately, from a planning perspective, what you need to have is two main parts. You've got inventory, so what you can physically buy, and also the data, which allows you to understand which of that inventory source is valuable.
Yeah.
So first of all, if we talk about inventory, so the last 6 to 9 months, we've been doing a lot of work with media owners to actually create always-on PMPs. But part of that as well is also getting all the data from them, and media owners themselves are sat on quite a lot of data, which is really valuable for buyers. So if we think about when we take on inventory lists, we understand the locations of specific billboards. I just add a different colour in here for, say, for example, different media owner. And it's important to basically house all this data in a centralised planning tool. So for example, for us now at MiQ, we've done a lot of work obviously collating data and obviously housing it centrally. So from a buyer's perspective, if I want to say I want to target the Greater Manchester region, we can quite easily say we want to target all these billboards in this area here, for example. Now the next thing to understand is once you've got that inventory selection, is to understand which of those billboards are actually most effective for your advertising. So for us, what we're able to do is we've done a lot of work collating geocontextual data sets, so things like census data, to look at things like demography, Experian, looking at things like household income and things like that.
Right.
And we're able at a postcode level to kind of drill down and actually understand the makeup of these areas. So if I just bear with me here, to draw little postcode areas here, but you get the picture. But ultimately what it allows you to do is, a billboard in a certain area, we can kind of enrich that with different data sources.
Mm-hmm.
For us, what I think gets really interesting is when we can start adding like that time element to it, so understand how that audience moves throughout the day as well. And a great example of this is Skyrise. So Skyrise is a telco-based data set, which takes in pseudonymized contract data. You can look at things like mobile behaviours, web browsing, app browsing, collects passive location data as well, so you can understand how people move. And when you overlay this with a billboard estate, you can it starts to become really valuable for an out-of-home buyer. So what I'm trying to demonstrate here is, if we take one billboard in isolation, obviously we'll have audience density or index on this side, and we can have an hour of the day here. So if we think about a student audience, once we've defined an audience within, say for example, a Skyrise data set, we're able to understand that we may see a low density during the middle of the night, we may see it peak at around 12 o'clock, we may see them average around midday and obviously peak towards the end. So if you're a programmatic out-of-home buyer, if you're an out-of-home buyer in general, you want to try and target the areas or the billboards where you're seeing the highest index of your audience. So you'd be wanting to try and target effectively these hours of the day. But if you want to buy in a traditional way, you would effectively be getting a flat share of voice across that time of day.
Yes,
if that makes sense?
Yeah.
So what this allows you to do from a programmatic buyer is to isolate the areas where, or the times of day of week, or venues as we like to call them, to actually start buying those bids, if that makes sense. Yeah, so the next thing we need to do is obviously take this plan and push it into the DSPs.
Yes.
And one of the choices there is which DSP to use, and actually how can we best utilise this data. So back at the start of 2021, we did a lot of work actually assessing our buying platform, so ultimately to facilitate this buying. So for us, we wanted to have best access for inventory. So obviously Trade Desk and Hivestack for us, we're really strong in those areas, but also allows us to take this plan and actually push it into the DSPs. Hivestack are great for that. They've got like an audience tool which allows you to do that, and audience files tools, and Trade Desk, we're looking to leverage some of their APIs as well, so actually to do this in real time. But ultimately as a trader, what you want to be balancing is delivery of that campaign with audience density, because obviously as I mentioned before, there's that non-guaranteed element, there's the risk that you might not be able to deliver it if you're only targeting certain venues.
Yeah.
So as a trader, what you're effectively trying to do is balance like the threshold of audience index and delivery of the campaign, if that makes sense.
It does. It sounds complex.
It's not too complex. It's more about obviously
like a really good balancing act.
It's a balancing act. I think all trading's a balancing act.
Well, absolutely, that's very true.
You're balancing obviously, how effective your on target reach versus the actual delivery of that campaign.
Yeah, we're in the big leagues now.
Yes, we're in the big leagues. Yes. And finally, all this sounds great, but ultimately, how do we measure it? How do we actually measure the impact of it? And I think for us at MiQ, first of all, we want to be able to report back on, first of all, transparency on where your media's been spent.
Yeah.
So the way our traders report back on this is aligned with a lot of our other channels as well. So we want to look at things like give full transparency on screen, with how much media spend's gone to certain screens, actual playouts of certain screens, like hour of day of week. So as a buyer, you've got a much granular view, a more transparent view on your actual media activation. The second part, which I don't think there's a silver bullet for just yet, is actually how do you measure the impact on that?
Yeah, of course.
Because you think about it, everything at the moment is based on assumption. So it's assuming that someone's been exposed to a billboard and hopefully they've gone on to go to a drive footfall to store or like an online visitation. So there's a few things we're looking into doing into measurement. So for example, we can look to do like geo tests. Also a disadvantage of that is that in some areas you may not actually have any media running. But an area for us which we're looking into more frequently now is actually the use of mobile data, so things like footfall tracking.
Right, okay.
And we've been working with AdSquare, obviously mobile location-based company, to actually try and build audiences who've been exposed to out of home. And the way they do this is, again, if I try and my art skills coming out here. So a billboard.
I'm loving it, Ben.
Yeah. What they end up doing is they draw basically an area in the front of a billboard which they would deem as to be an exposure area. So people who fall in this area, you could say they've been exposed to a digital out-of-home billboard. So what they do is in real time they will just collect all the mobile device IDs which come into this area, And then in terms of us actually building that exposed group, we can cross-reference that with our play-out time. So people, when we know an ad's been played, we can then look for the people who've been in that vicinity during that same time. So what that allows us to do is build an audience who've been highly being exposed to that billboard. Now, once we've got that data, we can feed that back into activation, so we can understand which billboards are, performing well, which ones are driving high footfall to store, which ones are driving sales online or traffic to site. And we start looking at this in relation to a control group as well. So looking at people out when the billboard hasn't been played, and we can start looking at like lift and things like that to try and assume measurement of an out-of-home campaign. So like you said, it can be quite complex. But I guess for us, from a buyer's perspective, if we're trying to facilitate this for clients, all this would come through nice shiny reports and things like that.
And who doesn't love a shiny report?
Exactly. Exactly.
I think what's interesting for me is looking at the work that Ad Square do in terms of looking at who might have been exposed to an ad. I'm fascinated by how a buyer would buy into investing in programmatic digital out of home versus other programmatic channels or versus traditional out of home, in fact. And so things like this, would they go, well, actually, from a viewability perspective, how do you know, just because they were in that area, how do you know you've seen the ad? I mean, I'd argue that is advertising all over. A lot of it is a series of assumptions, right? So how is this any different? But how are you working with buyers to get them to see the value of investing in this medium?
Yeah, so I think if you look at it from two perspectives, I think if you look at digital buyers as they are, obviously the cookies agenda is front and centre now.
Absolutely.
Everything's more privacy centric. For me, I feel like it can level the playing field, and if anything, it's a screen outside of their phones or their laptops. For a buyer, it's kind of extending that frequency into bigger screens. I think for us, from a programmatic perspective, we've become so used to seeing everything on a one-to-one basis, measuring everything. But I think as those two worlds start coming together, where measurement potentially is up in the air, how are we going to start doing that in the future? Buying programmatically digital at home potentially allows it to be on the same playing field as potentially like web-based environments. I also think from a traditional buyer's perspective, utilising some of the programmatic technologies massively increases efficiencies, levels of control when it comes to buying, and effectively much easier buying process. I also think as well that panel by panel addressability opens up stronger creativity in the market, so you can start looking at utilising the context of that billboard or the macro trends around there to kind of enhance your messaging. So say for example, if we know billboards are say near McDonald's, if I'm Burger King, we can start looking to try and target those billboards in a different way than if they were somewhere further away. So I think it's being more data driven from a traditional approach, and I guess having that omni-channel presence when it comes to digital buyers.
Yeah, I think what's interesting and a point to really hammer home on is that this is specifically programmatic digital out of home.
Yes.
So actually, a lot of what's been bought in the digital space and out of home over the past couple of years has not been programmatic. It's been more digital, so it's probably been more reservation based still.
Yeah. And
this is the next step on from that. This is the real time bidding aspect of out of home.
Yeah. So I think if going back to like 2019, I think when View launched, I think it had they had their Smart Brick product. I think all of it coming down, when it comes down to the industry, they obviously want to try and automate this traditional approach because, on a direct one-to-one basis, everything can be quite heavy, quite high touch. And I think, like you mentioned, like when you move into digital at home, a lot of these tools or like the ability to automate that buying and actually evolve that process. But I think when it comes to programmatic, even though we're still in early days, first of all, it lowers the barriers to entry for lots of different advertisers.
Yeah, absolutely.
We're seeing quite a lot of interest from like overseas buyers wanting to get in the UK market.
Oh, interesting.
But ultimately, it's like for us, it enhances out of home for me. I think like by having that panel by panel addressability, you can start actually buying digital at home in the same way you would start buying programmatic in the web, basically.
I mean, so brilliant. I mean, and so from the next perspective of what comes after this, like this is still quite nascent.
Yeah.
Everything you're talking about is still kind of in test phase in a lot of cases.
Yeah.
What is next? What are the things we can look forward to in the next couple of years?
I think it's the development of the things we just talked about. So from a digital perspective, that omni-channel play. So how can we start running digital at home in relation to our other digital channels? So looking at things like cross-channel management, extension of audiences across a plan. How can we start tracking the performance of digital at home in relation to everything else? So bringing it closer to that digital world, I think, is something which is going to be really exciting for buyers. As mentioned before, from a traditional perspective, how can you start being more creative with your out of home plans? So I think we've seen some of the award-winning campaigns in out of home. We've been like a weather activated campaign, things like that, which for programmatic buyers, you know, I think has kind of not been and gone, but it's a bit of a shiny toy we've had. But I think for us, being more creative, our ability to enrich the geocontextual signals to actually utilise those in messaging, I think that's been really strong for traditional out-of-home buyers. For me, I think what I'd love to see the industry is to kind of jump on how can we start measuring this. And I guess if you think about like something like the pandemic or pingdemic, potentially they could use some of those beacon trackings to potentially help measure things like that. I know it's been done in the past, but for us, being able to look at things like biometrics or ways to actually measure exposure, I think for us is going to be something which is going to move the needle really.
I guess, and with that moving needle comes the next challenge, which will be the safety, the privacy around that will be the big conversation, I'm sure.
Exactly. I think it's a bit of a balancing act, and I think it's quite, at this moment in time, I think it's quite hard to determine where it's going to go. But I think the out-of-home industry as a whole, I think, you know, measurement's always been key. Transparency in where your ads are being served is also really important. I think if we try and, I guess, head in that right direction, I think with privacy in mind, I think the channel as a whole, I think, will fit quite nicely into the rest of our digital space.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, I love it. I think that it's a really exciting medium, and I'm excited to see where it continues.
Yes.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Ben.
Thank you for having me.
That has been Trade Talk TV. We'll see you next time.